By the time I sat down at the table in our gathering space on Tuesday morning this past week, just as our 2-day retreat was about to begin, I was already something. Exhausted, wound up, worn out. It was one of those times when you can physically feel the anxiety, the stress weighing on you. One of my favorite things in the world is to worship with fellow pastors and deacons and musicians and church leaders at conferences like these. But as opening worship began a few minutes later, I could barely muster the energy to even stand for the call to worship. Not even 24 hours earlier, I had gotten the news, while not altogether unexpected, that 2 of our beloved church family members had died. It also happened to be my day off, and I had already committed weeks before to being the designated driver for a friend during a medical appointment, which I couldn't just bail on last minute. And of course, I was able to stay in touch with what was happening by phone, but it still pained me to be away and to essentially feel powerless to do much else in the moment. And this, of course, was on top of all the other demands of the week, not least of which has been managing our pest control situation. And so, the next morning, as I scrambled to pack and drive up to Lake Geneva for this retreat, though not before a last-minute pit stop to church to pick up some supplies we needed, it felt like I was already done on Tuesday morning, before my week had really even begun. For many of us, it can feel like these moments of being exhausted and worn out and done are inherently somehow unfaithful. A slump to snap out of, a problem to be fixed, a battle to overcome. Just pray harder or have a little faith, the voices tell us, as if it were really that easy. And we certainly don't feel like we have permission to doubt and question and wrestle. And yet today, we encounter the story of Jacob, who wrestles. I don't know if I'd still be a Christian if this week's Old Testament story wasn't in the Bible, writes Debbie Thomas. More than any other story in Scripture, Jacob's story has helped me to hang on and has given me permission to bring my whole turbulent self before God. By the end of the story, Jacob, who becomes Israel, the patriarch of 12 tribes of a great nation, hardly seems to be the pinnacle model of faithfulness here, by the side of the Jabbok River. Jacob, whose birth name, you may recall, means heel grabber, once schemed with his mother to steal his older brother's birthright and then fled out of fear of retribution. And now, after so many years of estrangement, Jacob is understandably afraid of what Esau and his army of 400 men will do to him. He sends gifts and even his own family ahead of him in an attempt to soften and appease Esau. And that's where we find him at the start of this bizarre story. Alone, afraid, anxious, done. When out of nowhere an unnamed assailant appears who wrestles with him. Now, the identity of Jacob's wrestling partner is a mystery. Is it God, as we often assume, although the text never actually says that? Is it one of Esau's men spying on an enemy camp? Or is it Jacob's conscience, his own inner demons catching up with him? Or maybe the obscurity is intentional, inviting us to put ourselves in Jacob's place. We who wrestle with so many things. As a church family these last few years, we have, of course, wrestled our way through the pandemic, from abruptly shutting everything down to cautiously reopening one phase at a time. And in the midst of that reality, you also wrestled your way through a pastoral transition. And together we have wrestled our way through the grief that comes from the loss of beloved members of our community, whether those who have died or those who have just moved away. With every loss, it feels like the grief gets a little heavier and the wrestling a little harder. Today, Jacob's story gives us permission to wrestle. With Israel, we are encouraged to wrestle with our faith, with our vocations and daily living, with what it means to be the Lutheran Church of St. Philip in this post-pandemic world. I don't know what this congregation or any congregation or the wider church of which we are a part will look like 5, 10, 20 years from now. To be perfectly honest, some days I'm not even sure what will look like 5 minutes from now. But what I do know is this. The people of God know what it means to wrestle. Our very identities and institutions are the product of a history of wrestling, of asking questions, of pushing back against the status quo, of stirring things up in the pursuit of what is just and right, of always being made new. We are, after all, the Church of the Reformation. We are a wrestling people. Our wrestling is not over, and neither is the work that God is doing in and through us. By the time my retreat ended on Wednesday afternoon, my wrestling wasn't over. It never really is, though, is it? But I was a lot less done. There's something about being in a community like that is renewing and healing. After just 36 hours of worshiping and learning and being together with colleagues and friends, I was reminded, above all, that I wasn't alone in my wrestling. On the bank of the Jabbok River, Jacob sat alone, afraid and anxious. He didn't have all the answers. He's certainly not someone who always got it right. Jacob was alone until he wasn't. Jacob wrestles, and this mysterious stranger with whom he wrestles blesses him because of it. There is a blessing in the wrestling. That blessing doesn't equal perfection, but results for Jacob in his physical limb, a reminder of Jacob's imperfection. Both blessed and bruised, very good and imperfect, saint and sinner. Jacob's wrestling was surely far from over, but in the blessing, he also somehow knew that God wasn't done with him yet. With Jacob, we are invited and called to wrestle with who we are and with where God is calling us. We are invited to wrestle and claim the blessing that is ours in the waters of baptism, and to receive the blessing that God gives for us in this meal of bread and wine. There is a blessing in our wrestling, reminding us that we are not alone. God's blessing in and among this community refuses to let us go. God's blessing here and now embraces us where we are, as we are, and calls us God's very own, even and especially in the wrestling.